The word pilgrimage itself most often brings to mind religious pilgrimage. The Muslims' once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to the sacred city of Mecca as required by their 7 pillars of faith. The Jewish pilgrimage to touch and to pray at the Wailing Wall, once the base on which Solomon's temple rested. As you know, not only do major religions practice pilgrimage, but so-called pagan worshippers make pilgrimages to their sacred sites. The Mayas to pyramid centres they built, Aborigines to Ayers Rock, and to other places of significance to Aboriginal tribes, where their dreamings are recorded. For its practitioners, the religious pilgrimage is a transformative journey to a sacred centre, a holy site. It may be a spiritual exercise, an act of devotion, a source of healing, or an act of penance. Some religious pilgrims seek the erasure of sins, others look for forgiveness. Still others earn merit for their gods or goddesses. For someone who lived 700 years ago, Geoffrey Chaucer was a remarkably perceptive fellow. He lived in a world where disease was incurable, science was unexplained, and where God was the answer to most questions. Chaucer gives no hint that he had any great desire to answer the great questions or solve the problems of his day. But upon reading the Canterbury Tales, one cannot help but feel that he was a sharp-witted, deep thinker who saw through many of the hypocrisies of his day. Evidence suggests that Geoffrey Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales, was born between 1340 and 1344 in London. His father was a vintner, responsible for the transmission and disposal of wines for various royal households. So Chaucer is likely to have spent much of his childhood at the wharves, watching the unloading of great casks of wine and listening to the stories of sailors and dockhands. The adult Chaucer lived at the centre of the affairs of his day, working in a variety of roles as a soldier, a courtier, a controller of customs, as a JP and an MP, as well as a page in a royal household. Chaucer would have been exposed to court society, to French and to Latin, and to the elegant code of manners and ceremonies of court life. He moved up the ranks in his working life, but had an empathy for the lower classes and their virtues. Midway through Chaucer's career, through some complex shifts of power in the court, he was deprived of his offices and found himself without occupation. He must have been an interesting fellow. He had conversed with people from all walks of life, yet finding himself without employment and fitting nowhere in particular, he had time to ponder the idiosyncrasies of them all. Clearly a resourceful fellow, Chaucer used his spare time to record the people in his world as he saw them, binding them together in a fictitious pilgrimage which gives us an insight into medieval life that is truly a treasure. My liking of the poet Chaucer has been something of a romance of its own. Just before beginning my final year of school, I was lucky enough to sing evensong at Canterbury Cathedral on a school choir trip to Germany and England. Although the performance was rather a disappointment, with 99% of the audience being directly known to us, it was an honour to be considered good enough to sing there. And undeniably a memorable experience. Like so many British and European cathedrals, it was built on a scale unimaginable to those of us whose benchmark of a big cathedral was defined by those seen in Adelaide. Not long after returning from this trip, I began my final year of school and studied Chaucer as one of 2 poets in Year 12 English. It seemed to me that the study of Chaucer was a gift, I knew no more about the Middle English than anyone else did, but ably assisted by an excellent translation, I regarded understanding Chaucer's Pilgrims a walk in the park compared to the ramblings of Judith Wright. I loved the vision of Chaucer and his pilgrims making their way from London to the cathedral I had seen in Canterbury to visit the grave of St Thomas a Becket on horseback, stopping at inns along the way and sharing their tales. The image is even richer now that I've had my fair share of meals in English pubs and enjoyed their crooked walls, their open fires and medieval beams. Those of you who have seen something of the towns and villages of England will know how easy it is to remove in one's mind the traffic and the chain stores and place oneself 700 years back in time amidst the buildings and cobbled streets, much as they remain today. The Canterbury Tales begins with a prologue in which a group of people from all walks of life stumble upon each other at an inn in Southwark, all on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St Thomas a Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. The pilgrimage had become, by the 14th century, a popular form of excursion and included the whole spectrum of society, from knight to ploughman. The innkeeper suggests that since they are all going to the same place, they go together and take turns at telling tales to pass the time. The narrator describes all the people assembled at the inn and takes it upon himself to record their stories, apologising to his reader that if he is to do it accurately, he must retell the stories as he hears them, warts and all. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting any of Chaucer's pilgrims, I would like to introduce the one I know best, the Pardoner. Chaucer paints him as the most delicious of crooks, embodying the corruption and dishonesty rife in church and society. It was, incidentally, the Pardoner's tale that I told the children. In the prologue that precedes all the tales, the Pardoner is described as having hair as yellow as wax and smooth, which hints perhaps at a lack of virility and effeminacy of mind. The suggestion could be that he's homosexual and therefore outcast. With no good reputation to lose, perhaps he considers it his right to take all he can from society. A medieval pardoner earned his living capitalising on a fear of God, claiming to be able to grant absolution to those who paid for a confession. His tale begins with a prologue where he tells the pilgrims with the greatest of sincerity that he is nothing but a crook. For my intent is naught but for to win, and not at all for punishment of sin. He's not ashamed to reveal the details of his deceptions, taking full advantage of his place in the pulpit to espouse a wisdom that he himself ignores. Radix malorum est cupiditas. Greed for money is the root of all evil. He tells the pilgrims his sacred role as pardoner and shows them all his pardons, beginning with our liege lord's seal, a sign that sanctified his role as chosen in some way to carry out Christ's holy work. He tells us that he speaks a few words of Latin to spice up his sermons, showing hollow crystal stones and a bag of holy relics and bones. He claims that a bone he's just picked up off the ground comes from a holy Hebrew sheep, and that it can cure illnesses in people and beasts alike. It can be used to stir a brew that will cure a man of jealousy for his wife's lust, and specifically says this will work even if he knows that she's sleeping with not one but 2 priests. He is happy to admit that he tells the congregation that only those whose sins are not so very great can earn one of his pardons. Anyone who does not come and pay for a pardon, therefore, must have committed unimaginable sins, so best to buy a pardon and preserve one's reputation. One can almost see Chaucer, quill in hand, sitting at his desk, laughing as he writes about this rogue and thinking of the parallels he is so cleverly drawing with people of his world.